My dad slapped me at the airport for refusing to carry my brother's bags. My brother laughed. I never imagined 300 strangers would witness the moment my family finally broke me. My name is Everly, and I was 26 when my father, Dale, raised his hand against me inside JFK Airport. The terminal was crowded, announcements echoing overhead, while my brother Mason stood beside a pile of expensive luggage, grinning like he owned the place. "Carry these," Dad ordered. I stared at the bags. No. It was the first time I had ever refused him. His expression hardened. Then his hand struck my face. The sound seemed louder than the airport announcements. People turned. Someone gasped. Tears filled my eyes as Mason laughed beside me. Dad expected me to apologize. Instead, I wiped my cheek, looked directly at him, and made myself one promise. He would never touch me again, and neither would I carry their weight. The taxi pulled away from JFK, and I watched the terminal disappear through the rear window. I had no intention of getting on that flight. Whatever waited at the other end suddenly mattered less than getting somewhere my family couldn't reach me. As the city blurred past, memories I had spent years burying began surfacing. Mason had always been different in my parents' eyes. He never worked a summer job. He never worried about rent, tuition, or bills. If he needed something, Dad found a way to provide it. If he made a mistake, someone else cleaned it up. I learned early that my role was different. At 22, while most people my age were figuring out their first careers, I was quietly sending money toward my parents' mortgage. I never announced it. I never expected applause. I simply believed helping my family was what a good daughter did. Apparently, I had misunderstood the arrangement. One memory came back especially clearly. I was 12, sitting at the kitchen table while Dad talked about Mason's future as if mine didn't exist. "Mason's going to run this family one day," he said. "You just need to support him." I remembered nodding. For years, I did exactly that. But while everyone watched Mason, I built something of my own. I worked relentlessly in logistics consulting, taking difficult assignments, solving problems other people couldn't handle, and earning every promotion without my family's help. Eventually, my career became successful enough that I could have walked away from their financial demands completely. Yet I kept helping. Not once did Dad ask what I actually did for a living. Not once did Mason wonder how I managed everything. They knew I was dependable, and apparently that was enough. When the taxi finally stopped outside my apartment, I paid the driver and walked upstairs alone. My phone vibrated before I even unlocked the door. Then again, and again. I opened the family group chat. Dozens of messages filled the screen. "You owe your father an apology. How could you embarrass him like that? You need to make this right." Not one message asked whether I was okay. Not one person mentioned what Dad had done. I stood in my quiet apartment, staring at the screen, and finally understood something painful. They weren't upset because I had been hurt. They were upset because, for the first time, I had stopped being useful. 2 weeks before that airport, I still believed I was going to Santorini for my brother's wedding because I was helping my family. Mason was marrying Nadia, and everyone acted as though the celebration had somehow become my responsibility. Flights, vendors, schedules, hotel arrangements, transportation. Dale expected me to handle everything before the guests even arrived. "You're good at this," he said whenever I questioned it. What he never mentioned was how the wedding was being funded. I assumed Mason and Nadia had planned within their means. I had no idea Dad had taken out a massive loan against family property to cover the expenses. Worse, I didn't know my name had anything to do with it. A few days before the trip, I finally pushed back. "I have my own work," I reminded him. "I can't spend weeks managing Mason's wedding for free." Dad's response was immediate. "You do this for your brother, or you're not really part of this family." Those words stayed with me. I eventually agreed because arguing seemed easier than facing another family war. I rearranged my schedule, contacted vendors, reviewed transportation plans, and prepared to fly ahead so everything would be ready when Mason and Nadia arrived. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. That night, after returning home from work, I opened my laptop to check a scheduling document. An unfamiliar email notification appeared in my inbox. At first, I assumed it was another vendor. Then I saw the subject line. "Wire transfer authorization, Everly Carter." My stomach tightened. I opened it. The message contained banking information, a transfer amount, and a request for confirmation from a lender. But something was even more disturbing. My name appeared under guarantor. I read the document twice, then a third time. I hadn't authorized anything. I hadn't signed anything. And I certainly hadn't agreed to guarantee Mason's wedding expenses. My hands went cold as I scrolled further. There was a draft authorization attached to the email. My information was already filled in. Someone had prepared everything as though my consent were merely a formality. And suddenly, the argument at the airport didn't feel like an isolated family fight anymore. The bags, the wedding, Dad's demands, his insistence that I support Mason. It all began connecting in a way that made my chest tighten. For the first time, I wondered how much of my family's plan had been built around something I had never agreed to. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I opened the documents again and started reading every line instead of assuming there had to be some innocent explanation. There wasn't. The loan paperwork listed me as a cosigner. My name, address, financial information, and signature appeared exactly where they needed to be. But I knew I had never signed that agreement. Then I noticed something familiar in the authorization section. Power of attorney. Years earlier, Dad had asked me to help refinance the family house. He had convinced me the paperwork was temporary and necessary for the bank process. I had trusted him enough to sign documents without imagining they could later be used against me. Apparently, that trust had become his opportunity. My hands started shaking as I calculated what I could potentially owe. It wasn't a small family favor anymore. Tens of thousands of dollars were attached to a wedding I hadn't even agreed to finance. I immediately called Silas. He was one of the few people I trusted to tell me the truth without protecting my feelings. "Send me everything," he said. I forwarded the documents. There was silence while he reviewed them. Finally, he called back. "Everly, this is serious." My stomach dropped. "The power of attorney appears to have been used to authorize the transaction," he explained. "And according to these records, it hasn't been properly revoked. So I'm responsible? You could be, unless we challenge it immediately." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For years, I had thought my family's behavior was simply unfair. Dad favored Mason. They expected me to help. They took my sacrifices for granted. But this was different. This was deliberate. Someone had used my identity to secure money without my permission. I wasn't dealing with hurt feelings anymore. I was dealing with fraud. Silas told me not to confront Dale yet. "Don't warn him," he said. "Protect yourself first." For once, I listened without hesitation. I logged into every financial account connected to the old arrangements. One by one, I reviewed the automatic permissions and payment authorizations I had forgotten existed. Then I removed them. No announcement. No angry message. No warning. Just one quiet confirmation after another. Authorization canceled. When the final permission disappeared, I closed my laptop. For the first time in years, money was no longer flowing from me toward people who treated my support like an entitlement. And they had absolutely no idea it had stopped. For the next several days, I treated my own life like a case file. I saved every bank statement, downloaded every message from Dad, and made copies of the authorization documents. I even created a timeline showing when I had supposedly agreed to transactions I knew nothing about. The more I organized, the worse it became. Dad's messages were full of phrases like, "Keep the peace for Mason," and "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Every conversation somehow ended with me being responsible for protecting my brother from consequences. At work, Grant noticed I wasn't myself. He was my boss, but more importantly, he respected my judgment. When I finally explained what was happening, he didn't tell me to forgive my family. He simply asked, "What do you need?" That question nearly broke me. I realized how rare it was for someone to care about what I needed instead of what I could provide. That evening, I searched through old financial records and discovered something I hadn't expected. My college fund. Years earlier, money had disappeared from the account Dad controlled. He had told me there had been an administrative problem and that I shouldn't worry because everything would be handled. I had believed him. Now I compared the dates with old bank records. The money had been transferred shortly before Mason needed funds for one of his early business ventures. My stomach turned. It wasn't one incident. It was a pattern. That weekend, I visited Grandma June. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything. She had always been different from the rest of them. She never compared me to Mason. She never expected me to earn love through sacrifice. After a long silence, she reached across the table and held my hand. "Your father built his whole life on what you gave up," she said softly. "Don't let him take the rest of you too." I looked down at our hands. For years, I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. That afternoon, something inside me became completely still. I wasn't going to scream at Dale. I wasn't going to humiliate Mason. I wasn't going to chase apologies. I would simply stop funding the life they had built around my obedience. The wedding had been planned with my money, my labor, and my silence. Now all three were gone. And I intended to let reality arrive exactly when their carefully constructed plans could no longer hide from it. I didn't make my next move emotionally. I made it carefully. Silas prepared the paperwork to revoke the power of attorney, and I signed every document he placed in front of me. We sent formal notices to the bank and the wedding's payment processor at the same time. There would be no opportunity for Dad to make another decision using my name. Once everything was confirmed, I sat quietly at my desk and waited. The first call came from Santorini. The wedding planner had contacted Dad because one of the major deposits had bounced. She needed an explanation immediately. Dad apparently didn't have one. He had assumed the money would continue moving exactly as it always had. Meanwhile, Mason remained completely unaware of what was happening. That evening, he was having dinner with Nadia's family, confidently talking about the wedding as though every detail had already been handled. He spoke about the venue, the decorations, the transportation, and the plans for the ceremony. "Everything's taken care of," he told them. I wasn't there to hear him say it, but Nadia later described the scene to me. Mason had never needed to understand how anything worked behind the scenes. Someone always made sure it did. This time, that someone wasn't me. Back at home, my phone remained silent for several hours. Then it rang. Dad. I watched his name appear on my screen and let it stop. A few minutes later, another call came. Then another. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, a voicemail appeared. I pressed play. At first, his voice was exactly what I expected. "Everly, what did you do?" His tone was sharp, demanding. Then there was a pause. "You need to call me back immediately." Another pause followed. His voice changed. "I don't understand what's happening." He sounded less certain now. Then came the words I had never expected to hear from him. "Please call me." I listened until the message ended. For years, Dad had spoken to me as though my cooperation were guaranteed. Now, for the first time, he was speaking like a man who had suddenly discovered that the person he depended on could actually walk away. I placed the phone face down. The silence afterward felt different. Not frightening. Freeing. The thread had been pulled. And somewhere in Santorini, the first pieces of their perfect wedding were beginning to unravel. The next morning, the wedding planner gave Dale 48 hours. If the outstanding payment wasn't received, the venue would cancel the reservation. For the first time, the perfect Santorini wedding Mason had been bragging about had a deadline attached to it. Dad called me repeatedly. I watched the calls stack up on my screen and didn't answer. Then Mason appeared at my apartment. He didn't knock politely. He stood outside my door with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. "What did you do?" I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. "Nothing you need to worry about." His jaw tightened. "The wedding is falling apart. Dad says the payments aren't going through. The planner keeps calling. Fix it." There it was. "Not are you okay? Not what happened to you. Just the same expectation I had spent my entire life carrying." I looked at him. "I was never supposed to fix everything for you." Mason scoffed. "You're my sister. And apparently that means I'm responsible for your bills, your mistakes, and your wedding." His expression changed. "You've always helped me." I almost laughed. A memory flashed through my mind. Mason was 17 when he wrecked Dad's car. I was the one who helped explain the damage. At 21, he missed an important payment. I covered it. When he struggled with a business expense, I quietly transferred money. Every time, I told myself family helped family. But standing there, I finally understood the difference between helping someone and carrying them. "I've helped you enough," I said. Mason stared at me as though I had spoken another language. "You can't just abandon us." I didn't abandon anyone. I stopped volunteering to be responsible for people who refused to be responsible for themselves. His face reddened. "You're destroying my wedding." "No," I answered quietly. "I'm just not paying for it anymore." For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Mason turned sharply and walked away. The door closed behind him. I expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt strangely calm. About an hour later, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Dad. It wasn't Mason. It was Nadia. Her message contained only one sentence. What actually happened at that airport? I stared at the screen. Until that moment, Everyone had accepted Dad's version. Now, someone finally wanted to hear mine. Nadia and I met the following afternoon at a quiet cafe far from my neighborhood. She arrived alone without Mason, and the first thing she said was, "I need to know the truth." So I told her. I told her about growing up in Mason's shadow, constantly being expected to support him, while my own sacrifices went unnoticed. I explained what happened with the loan documents, the old authorization, and the way my name had been used without my permission. Then I told her about the airport. When I finished, Nadia sat silently for several seconds. "I knew something wasn't right," she finally said. "I just didn't know how bad it was." She explained that she had noticed things long before the wedding. Dale always talked about Mason's needs as though they were everyone's responsibility. Whenever money became a problem, Everly's name somehow entered the conversation. "But I never had proof," Nadia admitted. Now she did. Her expression hardened. "I can't marry him like this." I stared at her. "You don't have to choose between me and Mason," I said. "This isn't about choosing you," she replied. "It's about choosing what kind of marriage I want." That evening, Nadia confronted both Dale and Mason. She told them the wedding would not continue if its foundation depended on money taken through Everly. Mason became defensive immediately. "You don't understand our family." Nadia shook her head. "I understand enough." Dale tried another approach. "This is a private family matter." "No," Nadia answered. "It became my matter when you used money you weren't entitled to use." For once, Dad had no quick response. His anger appeared first, then frustration, then something I had almost never seen on his face. Fear. The wedding was suddenly no longer under his control. Nadia told them she would postpone everything until Everly was legally released from the loan and the situation was properly addressed. Mason looked stunned. Dad looked defeated. And I realized the consequences were finally reaching the people who had created them. That night, I heard a knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Dad stood there. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't giving orders. He looked exhausted. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he lowered his eyes. "Everly," he said quietly, "can we talk?" It was the first time in my life my father had come to my door without demanding something. This time, he was asking. I stepped aside and let Dad enter. He stood in my living room like he had forgotten why he came. For once, there were no commands waiting on his tongue. "I made a mistake," he began. I said nothing. He tried again. "I was under pressure. Mason's wedding was important. I thought you would understand." That sentence told me everything. Even now, he was explaining his choices instead of taking responsibility for them. "You used my name," I said. "You put me on a loan without permission. I never meant for it to hurt you. But you meant to do it." His expression tightened. Then came the guilt. I sacrificed everything for this family. I looked at him calmly. And somehow, I was always the one expected to sacrifice more. He started talking about Mason, the wedding, the embarrassment, and how I had made everyone suffer. But I interrupted him. "You're still asking me to carry the consequences." The room went silent. I told him about the years I had spent fixing problems that weren't mine. I reminded him of the financial help he accepted without gratitude. I told him what it felt like to be treated as a resource instead of a daughter. Then I touched my cheek. "And you slapped me." Dad looked away. "That shouldn't have happened." "No, it shouldn't have." The door opened behind him. Mason walked inside. For the first time, there was no smug expression on his face. He looked at me, then at Dad. "I heard everything," he said quietly. "I expected him to defend our father. Instead, he lowered his head. I shouldn't have laughed. Those words didn't erase anything, but they mattered." I looked at both of them. "You didn't lose a daughter at that airport. You lost the only person still willing to hold this family together." Dad's eyes filled with tears. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want my life back." Then I gave him one condition. "If you want any relationship with me going forward, I need a complete legal release from that loan. And I need a real apology. Not one because the wedding is in trouble. Not one because Nadia is angry. One because you understand what you did." Dad nodded slowly. For once, nobody argued. Nobody demanded anything from me. And when they finally left, I closed the door behind them knowing something had changed permanently. I wasn't waiting for my father's approval anymore. I had already given myself permission to walk away. I used to think freedom would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt like waking up one morning and realizing nobody was waiting for me to solve their problems. My father's financial ties were gone. The legal paperwork had separated me completely from his accounts and obligations, and every dollar I earned finally belonged to the life I wanted to build. I moved into a new apartment using nothing but my own income. It wasn't enormous or fancy, but walking through that door gave me a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Everything inside it was mine. The wedding eventually happened, but it looked nothing like the celebration Mason had imagined. He and Nadia paid for a smaller ceremony themselves. Nadia remained cautious around Dad, and their relationship never returned to the way it had been before. Mason reached out once. His message was awkward. He admitted he had treated me badly and said he wanted to rebuild our relationship. I didn't block him, but I didn't run back either. For once, I understood that accepting someone's apology didn't mean handing them immediate access to my life. Then one morning, I found myself at JFK again. The same airport, the same rushing passengers, the same overhead announcements. But this time, I stood there alone with my own suitcase and my own boarding pass. Nobody was ordering me around. Nobody was handing me someone else's bags. Nobody needed me to rescue a situation. As I walked toward my gate, I realized the place that once represented humiliation no longer had power over me. I hadn't lost myself at that airport. I had finally stopped abandoning myself for everyone else. I used to think family meant carrying everyone else's weight. That day at the airport, I finally understood. The bags were never the problem. I was just done carrying people who'd never once carried me.